This is the backup video to European history for Tuesday, September 22nd, 2020. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So you all should have your notes out. Your work should be turned in. Yesterday we talked about what a dark age might mean. We talked about the lights of civilization prior to that, how Byzantium shielded the West by its very existence, preventing the direct invasion from the Islamic Middle East through Anatolia and the Balkans into the heart of Christendom. The Byzantines shielded us for 1,000 years, from the fall of Western Empire until its fall in 1453, to some extent or another interrupting this. So when the Islamic invasion comes, as it inevitably does, it is a much weaker thrust, like trying to reach into an old-style vending machine to steal a soda. You do not have the same strength doing this reach-around attack through North Africa, Iberia, and up into Spain as you would by coming the most direct route. Byzantium preserves Christendom without being part of Christendom, which is an interesting thing. Why? Why is Byzantium different? You took ancient history last year. What is a difference that separates it from Western Christendom? Sir? You're not sure? Take a guess. No big deal. Here's a hint. Guess an aspect of life, and you're probably not that far off. So what is a basic aspect of cultural life? The way people live.
Well, their religion could be different.
In fact, it is. You're right. See? Got it on the first try. Alex? The idea is that Christianity is not monolithic. No major religion is. So one of the first schisms that occurs in Christianity is when the apostles go east and you have a split between Nestorian Christianity and the Christianity of the Mediterranean basin. There are also Christians that establish probably the first organized Christian church in Ethiopia, known as the Coptic Church. They have different rites than all other Christians, as do the Asian Nestorians. Millie? For a while, the Greek and Roman branches of the empire retain a common Christianity. However, with the fall of Western Empire, Jackson, you have a beginning cultural drift. And that drift includes not only much of the language of worship, which in the West is Latin and in the East is Greek, but a beginning drift in terms of, say, the authority of the emperor versus the authority of the Pope. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome, the successor to St. Peter. Colton? But in the West, the Pope has no peer. In fact, the Pope and the Church are equal and independent, at least, to the kings of Europe. But in the East, you still have an emperor. And that emperor is going to create difficulties in terms of there being an independent church. So there's another difference. Add to that a growing theological difference between the way that the Western Christians and the Eastern Christians saw God and the nature of Christ and the incarnation. All of these things created a drift between the two. But in the 800s AD, this drift becomes a formal split between Western and Eastern Christianity. So at first you've got drift, and then you've got an actual split as well as mutual hostility. Sorry about that. Miss Woodworth? Not here, is she? Oh. Memorize your first name finally, at least for the moment, and your last name escapes me. That's the way memory works. So, Byzantium, economically, culturally, religiously, is separate from Christendom, but it shields it. And though there is hostility between Western and Eastern societies, they are not mortal enemies, which is something that Islamic society becomes to most Europeans. An enemy that wishes to completely replace and supplant civilization. Now, in Spain, because of the massive amount of Christians who are under Islamic rule, and because of the fact that the Christian kings are not completely defeated, there is a different relationship that begins to develop between West and East. The Spanish consider this to be all Reconquista, the reconquest, a 700-year war from the time that Visigothic Christian Spain was conquered by the Muslims to the time when Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492 finally drive out the last of the Islamic states. But though there is constant ongoing strife and warfare, during Reconquista, there are also protracted periods of trade, exchange, and peace. The great hero of medieval Spain, El Cid, is in fact somebody who has worked not only for the Christian kings, but also for the Muslim rulers. So in Spain particularly, there's going to be a cross-cultural exchange, and this is something you need to understand. The Islamic world is much more advanced than the Christian West at this time. And they possess a lot of the heritage that the Christian West has lost. So exchanges between West and East usually involve some real cross-cultural exchange, and that includes the extending of more advanced ways of thought and doing things from the Islamic Easterners to the more primitive Westerners. And that's because the Dark Age in Western Europe was almost total. When Rome falls, the only institution of culture that retains anything like its ancient knowledge and structure is the Christian church. Now, as this happens, the bishops of Rome step forward. Even before the fall of Western Empire, this happens. You may recall the story of how Attila the Hun brought his Hunnic army to the very walls of Rome. The emperor was nowhere to be found. He was hiding in a swamp in Ravenna. The leader of Rome, sometimes known as the secret Western Emperor, was Pope Leo the Great, the Bishop of Rome, heir of St. Peter, head of the Christian faith in the West. He goes out, and whether he pays Attila off or whether he overawes Attila with the power and majesty of God and his church, the fact remains Attila turns without sacking Rome, without even attacking it. Pope Leo turns him away. Over a century later, there's another pope, but this time Rome's gone. Pope Gregory, the first Benedictine pope, a monk who has taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a monk of the order of Saint Benedict, which began to preserve knowledge in seed form. Gregory innovates the term, which is still one of the favorite titles of the Roman Pope, the servant of the servants of Christ. Pope Gregory and the Benedictines help save civilization in the midst of a dark age. Pope Gregory does so by spreading out the authority of the Roman Pope into every Christian shrine, chapel, and church throughout Western Europe. There are competitors. There are Germanic Arian Christians. There are Celtic Christians who center in Ireland. And of course, there are the Eastern Christians from Byzantium. But in all cases, the Arian Christians become absorbed by the Catholic Christians who center in Rome. The Celtic Christians are ultimately absorbed through a series of conflicts and through synod, which are church councils. And the Easterners are shunted away as basically essentially foreign to the West. By preserving a solid church structure, the church becomes the central nervous system of an otherwise dead body. The church is the only organization in Western Europe that thinks on a continental scale, on a universal scale. The church is the only institution in Western Europe that maintains long-distance communications. As irregular as they are, they're the only ones who really do it. The church routinely sends out missions to various places and brings in representatives from those places. The church is the only institution that preserves literacy in any form. By this point, Europe is run by the equivalent of horse-riding biker gangs. But the church keeps all of this. In Benedictine monasteries, I say the church keeps knowledge alive in seed form. Let me explain. A seed, like an apple seed or a mustard seed, is something that is almost nothing in the present moment. It is a negligible little piece of wood. However, in the future, that seed may grow to be a mighty tree that produces much fruit, many other seeds. The Benedictine monks who begin collecting the books from the ruins of Rome's cities throughout Europe and begin copying those books, as time goes on, has less and less to do with the culture of those books. Eventually, you have Benedictine monks who may speak a version of medieval church Latin, but they don't understand. They don't understand what Cicero may say. They don't understand what the Romans who lived in a world of continent-wide contact and communication. By the way, I don't mind people doing work while the corrections while I'm speaking, so long as you have other notes out and are paying attention and are not being a distraction. So, what we have is monks that are beginning to copy books down almost as look-see pigeon. In other words, copying the shapes, copying the words, but not understanding the music. How is it possible that a monk living in Lindisfarne Monastery or at Whitby in England, on the east coast of England, living in a community of a few hundred men, could comprehend what Plutarch was writing about in his lives, could comprehend what Aristotle thought? Their worlds were utterly different. Try to imagine today the sole repository of human knowledge being some guy in Barrow, Alaska, with no personal experience of the world below Alaska, with no experience of being in a city of millions or of hundreds of thousands or of even tens of thousands of people, trying to understand what he was reading, what he was copying. But in that act of copying knowledge that they could not themselves comprehend or use, the monks preserved something as an act of faith in God for the future. They preserved books. They preserved the ancient knowledge for a time hence to come when God would find a purpose for them. That act saved Western civilization. Now, the character of the Dark Ages was not pure anarchic chaos. Human beings cannot survive and will not abide ongoing pure anarchic chaos. People crave order, they crave routine, and they crave some semblance of security. And pure anarchy gives none of those things. So what happens is when Roman government fails, and after the first flow of the tribes as they conquer their territory, new kingdoms arise. These kingdoms include Vandalic North Africa, Ostrogothic Italy, Visigothic Spain, Frankish Gaul, Anglo-Saxon England. Now, in the case of Anglo-Saxon England, there are subgroupings. There are several independent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in what we now call England, Angleland. All of these kingdoms, Germanic and Gothic, have government, have rule, have a structure of hierarchy which is going to become feudalism, and have an alliance with the Christian church. The purest of these alliances is the king of the Franks, deciding to give up his Germanic Aryan variant of Christianity and become a Catholic. When the Frankish king becomes a Roman Catholic, whatever distinction that had existed that separated the conqueror from the conquered is now erased. And what is left behind is one people. And the Franks end up unifying more quickly than any other post-Roman barbarian government because the religious distinction is erased. And it is soon true that the other barbarian kings do the same. Now, none of this would have been possible had the barbarians not been converted to Christianity, and there is an exception to the rule. One of the latest barbarian groups to invade Roman Europe, former Roman Europe, in the 600s AD, I think, 500, 600s, are the Langobards, the Longbeards, or what we call the Lombards. When the Lombards invade Italy, they are pagans. They turn churches into stables. They routinely defile Christian worship places. And they fight the Ostrogoths, they fight the Byzantines, they fight anyone because nobody is pagan like they are. They ultimately are absorbed. But their viciousness indicates what could have happened had the Franks, the Burgundians, and the others not been Christians before they conquered. The fact that they were Christians permits and allows Gregory the Great of the Roman Catholic Church to expand his power. Had the barbarians thought that the Christian faith was an enemy, rather than their own faith with a different denomination, they would have crushed the church. Those men in robes and skirts would not have had a chance, and the libraries would have been burned. As it is fortunate that the West has Byzantium to shield it, and it is fortunate that the West, whether you happen to be a Christian or not, whether you happen to like Christians or not, it is fortunate that the West had the Christian church and had a group of rulers who were also Christians, because that made it possible for civilization to be saved. Now, one of the interesting things that comes out of the Dark Age is a very important part of our freedom: the portability of our rights. The portability of our rights because of tribal law. The portability of our rights because of tribal law. This comes out of the Dark Ages. The portability of our rights because of tribal law. If I am a Frank, resisting all sorts of hot dog jokes, if I am a Frank and I travel to Visigothic Spain on business, for pleasure, whatever, and I've got the wealth and power to do that. Okay, I go into a Visigothic town in the Cantabrian Alps of northern Spain. And what I find there is a beautiful village where I'm going to spend a few weeks. But while I'm there, a series of murders happen. Human nature says that people don't want to admit that the people that they know and like, that they think they understand, are capable of horrible things like that. Human nature being what it is, I'm going to be the prime suspect. I'm a foreigner. I'm capable of violence. And I'm not from there. I know I said I'm a foreigner, and saying I'm not from there seems like doubling up on the same thing, because it's just that important. Because I'm an Auslander, an outsider, I am suspect, alien, different, dangerous. Now, that's bad enough. But under Germanic tribal law, I can't be judged by Visigothic standards of evidence. By those standards, I have to be judged by Frankish law, not Visigothic law. Even though I'm in a Visigothic country, I'm still a Frank. I carry my tribe with me. I carry my rights with me. I carry my law with me. What does this have to do with us? Can any of you guess? Having taken civics, having taken various kinds of government and history courses, what does the portability of rights and tribal law, as I have described it, have to do with us? I prefer a volunteer, but I'll roll if necessary. Really, we do need more active participation. I do my best to put it on the line, come here with energy. I would like it if you did the same. If that seemed grumpy, well, it's slightly grumpy, but please listen to what I'm saying. This can't work if it's just one way. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. What does the portability of rights and tribal law have to do with our freedom today? Will you roll? Thank you. 19. Will you roll? 7, 2, 4, 6. Daisy. Give it a try. I'll give you a hint. Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence. I'll give you a further hint, but then I expect your comment. The Declaration of Independence says, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So of that line, what bears the most resemblance to what I was just talking about? I didn't hear. If you want to write it, I'll read it. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain alienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You just let me know when you're ready. I may very well call on others of you to supplement the answer, so be ready. Can I see what we've got so far? I'll have a sense of whether it's in the ballpark or not. Thank you. Okay. It holds terms of overlapping. Did I get that right? Overlapping? Kept. Okay. In other words, rights are kept.
Unalienable rights.
Thank you. Overlapping kept, I get, is connected to inalienable rights. The word alien, what does it mean?
An outsider.
Right. Separate is another way of putting it. So when Jefferson writes about inalienable rights, he's talking about rights that are inseparable from the individual. Those rights don't come from human sources, they come from divine sources. And that is important, whether you personally are atheistic, agnostic, Christian, or a Zoroastrian. For this reason, Jefferson asserts, and our founding documents, up through our Constitution, which that flag represents, asserts that the rights that we have, because they're God-given, cannot be taken away righteously by human beings except under the most extraordinary of circumstances. They're inseparable from us. Life, liberty, property is what pursuit of happiness means. That inseparability, that inalienability, is what comes from the tribal law. It comes from this sense that if I'm a Visigoth traveling in the Burgundian lands, if I'm a Burgundian traveling in the Vandalic lands, if I'm a Vandal traveling in the Frankish lands, I have my law with me, and I am entitled to be judged under the standards of Frankish law or whatever my native law is, not the law of the people I'm with, not the law of the community I'm in. Now, modern legal systems have all sorts of interpretations of this, and particularly the Chinese are unwilling to allow something like this, and even modern law has somewhat blended that within the United States. If a foreigner does something here and they don't have a diplomatic immunity, they're probably not going to be judged under foreign legal standards. But the very concept of inalienability for our rights comes to us from that tribal law in the Dark Ages. Now we come to a moment of rebirth, a little renaissance, if you will. The Frankish king Karl makes alliance with the Pope and fulfills that alliance when he marches into Italy to drive out the Pope's enemies. King Karl of the Franks is in Rome on Christmas Day of the year 800. The Pope invites him to chapel, and there has a surprise for him. King Karl of the Franks is being made emperor of the West by the Pope. The Pope gives to the king of the Franks imperium, the power to command. In his name and his authority as the Bishop of Rome, he creates King Karl as the first Western Roman emperor in a very long time. And in a society, in a Dark Age society, literally living in the shadows of the ruins of ancient Rome, with aqueduct ruins that go from horizon to horizon, with roads that are hundreds of years old that are better than roads that are 20 years old, Roman emperor carries a real legitimacy. It matters. Karl of the Franks is known to us as Karl the Great, or Charlemagne. And Charlemagne and his empire consists of northern Spain, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, parts of Holland, parts of Germany, parts of Italy, and Switzerland. King Karl calls together all of these people and says that we might, if we try by God's grace, rebuild ourselves, we might recognize that the beings that built these ruins that surround us are not giants, they're not gods, they're our ancestors. And if our ancestors can do it, maybe we can too. Charlemagne's reign is the rebirth of hope that Europe can come back. And one of the things that Charlemagne does is he orders that all the book titles within his realm be gathered in monasteries and copied. The horrible truth is that when Charlemagne orders this, there are fewer book titles in all of his empire than are in the Hayden Public Library. That's how close our civilization comes to winking out. If we in the West retained none of our heritage, if we in the West didn't have these cities, these libraries, these books, if we didn't have a church that tried to grapple with the meaning of them, even if it failed, we would have been truly uncivilized savages, and we would have been food for the Muslims. We would have lapped up their culture like a hungry dog. But because we have those books, because we have literate churchmen or clerics who have a desire to understand and a commitment to copy those books, our own possession of our own intellectual heritage never completely winks out. It continues to burn ever so small. When Charlemagne dies, just before he dies, a new threat faces Europe, the Northmen. The prayer 100 years later heard all over Europe is, "Dear Lord, protect us from the fury of the Northmen." We know them as Vikings. The word Viking is from the Old Norse meaning to raid. The Vikings are raiders. And they come into Europe like a pagan blaze, but they come from the sea. One of the first things they do is they find the treasure houses of Europe, monasteries filled with gold and books on the islands off the coast of Europe, particularly in the British Isles. They're on these islands because the land has always been the source of barbarians. And on these offshore islands, they're safe. Maybe since they're over the horizon in some cases, they're not even known. But the Vikings don't come from the land. The Vikings don't come from the east. They come by sea, and they come from the north. In so many words. The Vikings threaten all of European civilization, and that is where we will leave it for the time being. Please clear everything off your desks so that I can give you the quiz. And those of you at home, I'll be cutting the live stream and the video.